If you want to create like the fastest song in Spotify history to hit 100 million streams, the absolute last thing you should do is delete the drums.
Right, yeah. That goes against literally every modern pop rule.
Exactly. I mean, we're living in an era totally defined by the TikTok attention span. The conventional wisdom across the entire music industry right now is that if the beat does not drop within the first, 3 seconds, the listener is just going to swipe away.
They're gone, yeah.
But if you look at the architecture of the biggest pop song of the decade, the producers made this completely counterintuitive gamble. Because for the first 40 seconds of the track, there is absolute terrifying rhythmic silence. No kick drum, no snare, no hi-hat, just a voice and a vintage keyboard.
It is a stunning defiance of modern pop algorithms. And, it paid off in a way that very few songs ever do. It honestly forces us to completely reevaluate what we think a guaranteed hit actually sounds like.
We are, of course, talking about Miley Cyrus's absolute juggernaut, Flowers. And before we even get into the weeds of how this thing was built, we really need to establish just how massively this gamble paid off. I was looking at the chart data before we sat down for this deep dive, and the statistics are just staggering.
Oh, they're unreal.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Yes, it hit that 100 million stream mark on Spotify in under a week, which is less than 7 days, by the way. But it's the longevity that really blew my mind.
You're talking about the adult contemporary chart numbers,
Right, exactly. It spent 112 weeks on the U.S. adult contemporary charts.
Wow.
That is over 2 years of continuous airplay. And out of those 112 weeks, it spent 57 weeks at number 1.
That officially makes it the longest running non-consecutive number 1 in the entire history of that chart.
Right. And you throw in the Grammys for Best Pop Solo Performance and Record of the Year, and, you aren't just looking at a hit anymore. You are looking at a permanent shift in the cultural atmosphere.
Yeah, it achieves a level of ubiquity where it basically ceases to be just a song and becomes a fixture of the environment. You hear it in grocery stores, in Ubers, at weddings, at the gym, and because it is everywhere, it is very easy to just dismiss it as simple. But the sonic architecture beneath that incredibly catchy melody is anything but simple.
Which is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. I mean, we are completely ignoring the tabloid drama. We are ignoring all the celebrity gossip. We want to deconstruct the specific production techniques of Flowers.
Absolutely.
We're going to dissect exactly how the drums, the bass, the synthesizers, and all those spatial effects were meticulously engineered. Because when you actually look at the session logs and the engineering breakdowns, you realize it's something pretty profound.
What's your takeaway?
Well, imagine walking into this beautiful, rustic 1970s cabin. It smells like old wood, it feels cozy, it feels weathered and nostalgic. But then you look incredibly closely at the grain of the wood, and you realize the logs aren't wood at all.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they are 3D printed carbon fiber, meticulously programmed by supercomputers to look and feel imperfect. That is exactly what this song is. It uses cutting-edge digital technology to engineer the illusions of 1970s analog.
That is a phenomenal metaphor. Seriously, the illusion of imperfection is the core philosophy of this track. But to understand how they built that cabin, so to speak, we have to start with the foundation.
Right.
Or rather, we have to start with the fact that they intentionally left the foundation out.
Yeah, let's talk about that massive 40-second drumless void at the beginning of the song. To really grasp why this works, I feel like we need a framework.
We do, and the best framework for understanding modern digital music actually comes from the musicologist Alan Moore. He developed this theory of functional layers in pop music.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, if you think about classical music, we use terms like homophony or counterpoint, right? But those terms totally fail to describe a pop track produced on a laptop in a digital audio workstation. Modern pop music is conceptualized vertically in stacked layers.
And Moore broke this down into 5 distinct layers, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. First, you have the explicit beat layer. This is usually your drum kit, the kicks and snares articulating the fundamental physical rhythm.
What part that makes you tap your foot.
Right. Second is the functional bass layer. This operates as the bridge. It provides the low-end physical frequencies, but also defines the harmonic root. Third is the harmonic filler layer.
Which would be what, exactly?
These are your rhythm guitars, your synthesized pads, basically the chords that flesh out the emotional color. Fourth is the melodic layer, which is almost always the lead vocal. And finally, a fifth layer that musicologist Megan Lavengood expanded upon, which is the novelty layer.
The novelty layer, I love that.
It's a great term. This contains the unusual timbres, the sound effects, the fleeting ear candy that grabs your subconscious attention.
So if we take Alan Moore's functional layers, explicit beat, functional bass, harmonic filler, melodic, and novelty, and we apply that diagnostic overlay to the first verse of Flowers, the X-ray comes back almost totally empty.
It really does.
The explicit beat layer is entirely gone. The functional bass layer is entirely gone. The novelty layer is empty. The biggest pop song in the world opens with literally nothing but the melodic layer, which is Miley's incredibly restrained vocal, and the harmonic filler layer.
It is an incredibly stripped back arrangement. And you mentioned earlier that this is a massive risk in the TikTok era, but it's a highly calculated risk based on the psychology of the listener.
How so?
By stripping away the explicit beat layer, the producers completely remove the physical impulse to dance. They are forcing your brain to focus entirely on the narrative vulnerability of the lyric. She's singing, we were good, we were gold, kind of dream that can't be sold. We were right till we weren't, built a home and watched it burn.
Right. And if you put a pounding 4-on-the-floor house beat under those specific words, the heartbreak just evaporates. It just becomes a generic club anthem.
Precisely. The void forces you to sit with her in the ashes of that burning house. And from a structural perspective, withholding the rhythm section creates an almost unbearable amount of neurological tension.
Because we're expecting it.
Exactly. We have been conditioned by decades of pop music to anticipate the drop. Your brain is actively searching for the explicit beat layer. By denying it to you for 40 seconds, the eventual arrival of the bass and drums feels violently explosive, even though the tempo hasn't changed at all.
It's all about manipulating the listener's energy. But because there are no drums to carry the energy in that first verse, all the weight falls on that harmonic filler layer. It falls entirely on those opening chords.
Yep.
And the sound of those chords is instantly recognizable. It sounds like a classic, slightly beaten up Wurlitzer electric piano.
The harmonic progression itself is relatively straightforward, actually, but incredibly effective. It moves from an A minor to an E minor to a G major to a C major.
It kind of loops back on itself.
It's a cyclical progression that feels like a person turning a thought over and over in their head. But then, right before the chorus, they hit this massive E7 chord.
And that E7 is the cliffhanger.
It is the ultimate harmonic cliffhanger. In the key of A minor, the E7 is the dominant chord. Due to the specific intervals within that chord, specifically the tritone between the G sharp and the D, it creates intense acoustic dissonance.
It desperately, physically wants to resolve back to the home chord of A minor.
Exactly. It acts as a harmonic slingshot, pulling the tension back as far as possible before launching the listener into the chorus.
But what really fascinated me in the engineering breakdowns was how they achieved the actual timbre of those chords. Because they didn't just wheel a 1960s Wurlitzer out of a storage closet and stick a microphone in front of it.
Not at all.
They synthesized it digitally. They built the instrument out of raw math.
This is where your 3D printed cabin metaphor perfectly aligns with the reality of the session. Building a convincing digital Wurlitzer is an incredibly complex physics problem.
Why is that?
Well, a physical Wurlitzer works by striking metal reeds with felt-covered wooden hammers. It has a very specific bark to it. To recreate that organically flawed sound digitally, the producers had to blend very specific geometric waveforms.
Right, I saw in the session logs they used a synthesizer patch, starting with a triangle wavetable in the sub-oscillator. Then in oscillator A, they used a waveform called a basic shape, and in oscillator B, they used a saw-rounded waveform.
That's right.
I really want to unpack this because to a layman, those are just geometry terms. Why do these specific shapes create the illusion of felt hitting the metal?
It all comes down to the physics of harmonics. If you generate a pure sine wave, it is perfectly smooth. It looks like a gentle ocean swell. It produces a single pure frequency with absolutely no overtone.
It sounds like a hearing test or a tuning fork.
Yeah, exactly. It has no character. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have a sawtooth wave. Visually, it looks like the jagged teeth of a saw. Sonically, it contains every single even and odd harmonic in the overtone series.
So it's super harsh.
Very harsh. It is incredibly bright, aggressive, and buzzy, like a synthesized brass section.
So a sine wave is too smooth and a sawtooth is too abrasive.
Exactly. A mechanical Wurlitzer reed is essentially a stiff piece of metal vibrating. It doesn't produce all the harsh upper harmonics of a sawtooth, but it's far more complex than a sine wave.
Okay, so how do they bridge the gap?
So, the producers started with a triangle wave in the sub-oscillator. A triangle wave has a hollow, slightly muted sound because it only contains odd-numbered harmonic, and their volume drops off very quickly. This provides the deep, hollow body of the electric piano.
The heavy wooden cabinet sound.
Yes, exactly. Then, to get the bark, the sound of the felt hammer aggressively striking the metal, they blended in that saw-rounded waveform in the upper registers.
Saw rounded, so a sawtooth with the edges sanded off.
A saw-rounded wave is exactly what it sounds like, yeah. A sawtooth wave, where the sharp, jagged points have been mathematically filed down. It gives you the aggressive, biting harmonics of the metal reed, but without the harsh digital aliasing that would make it sound like a cheap 1980s video game.
Wow.
They are carefully adjusting the phase relationship between these geometric shapes to cancel out the artificial brightness and leave only the organic warmth.
It is literally audio alchemy. But the tone alone doesn't sell the illusion, right? I mean, the Wurlitzer is famous for its wobble, its vibrato, and the producers didn't just apply some generic vibrato plugin.
No, they did.
They used an LFO, low-frequency oscillator, to modulate the amplitude, but they restricted that modulation entirely to the frequency band between 4 kilohertz and 5 kilohertz.
That's a crucial detail.
When I read that, it felt so incredibly specific. Why not just wobble the whole sound? Why surgically target the 4 to 5 kilohertz range?
Because that specific frequency range is biologically significant for human species.
Wait, really?
Yeah. If you look at the evolutionary biology of human hearing, the ear canal itself naturally resonates and amplifies sounds in the 2 to 5 kilohertz range. It is not a coincidence that this is the exact frequency range of a human baby crying.
Oh my gosh.
We evolved to be hypersensitive to those frequencies, so we could hear an infant in distress over the ambient noise of a forest or a storm.
Wait, are you saying they were using the evolutionary biology of a baby crying to make a pop song more engaging?
Essentially, yes. Audio engineers refer to this range as the presence or bite of a sound. If you want something to immediately grab the listener's subconscious attention, you boost the 4 to 5 kilohertz range.
That is wild.
By applying a slight rhythmic wobble only to those specific frequencies, they are literally hacking your biological attention span. Furthermore, by leaving the low frequencies and the ultra-high frequencies perfectly stable, it mimics the slight mechanical imperfections of a vintage amplifier circuit heating up and cooling down.
It creates movement. It breathes life into the digital code.
It does. It makes it feel real.
The precision of that is just mind-boggling. They're mathematically calculating a wobble in the exact frequency band our brains are wired to panic over, just to make a keyboard sound a little sadder.
That's modern pop production for you.
And this obsession with engineering imperfection leads us right into the transition out of the void. Because eventually, the void has to end. The verse concludes, the tension from that E7 chord reaches its breaking point and the song requires gravity. The rhythm section finally arrives.
And because the explicit beat layer, the massive pop drums, still hasn't fully kicked in to drive the groove yet, the entire responsibility of anchoring the song falls to Moore's second layer, the functional bass.
Right, and the story of how they produced the bass line in Flowers is perhaps my favorite part of this entire deep dive.
Oh, it's a great story.
Because it wasn't just a studio musician plugging a bass guitar into an amp. It was an exhaustive, multi-stage process of building a digital monster and then taming it with human hands.
The initial foundation was entirely synthesized, which is so ingrating. The producers sketched out the foundational groove using a highly advanced software synthesizer called Trillion. Yeah, which is essentially the industry standard for hyper-realistic bass synthesis.
But they didn't just use a preset, did they? The session notes show they took a high-resolution digital sample of a real instrument, a Fender Jaguar bass. Now, a Fender Jaguar is already a very punchy, distinct-sounding instrument.
Very punchy.
But they took that sample and combined it with a digital synthesizer oscillator called an analog BD Syn. Now, I had to look this up. BD stands for bass drum. It's an oscillator that generates a sine wave shaped exactly like the physical thump of a kick drum.
Right. They're essentially hiding a kick drum inside the bass line.
That's crazy.
They are tethering the harmonic pitch of the bass note to the physical, percussive impact of drum shell.
But they didn't stop there. They applied FM modulation to the synth. FM stands for frequency modulation.
Yep.
And instead of just blending two sounds together like mixing paint, FM modulation uses the frequency of one oscillator to violently vibrate the frequency of another. It creates these complex, metallic, unpredictable overtones that give the sound an aggressive bite. And they paired that with the wavetable called Sweet 20.
The resulting sound of all that digital processing would have been incredibly thick, but likely far too bright and buzzy to sit under a vocal track.
It would have clashed with her voice.
It would have sounded like a futuristic electronic dance track, yeah.
Which is why they applied a massive cutoff filter, absolutely obliterating every single frequency above 2 kilohertz.
That cutoff filter is the most crucial step in the digital bass chain. In audio engineering, a low-pass filter allows the low frequencies to pass through while cutting off the highs.
So it darkens the sound.
Exactly. By setting the threshold at 2 kilohertz, they completely removed any string noise, any fret buzz, any brightness, and any of the metallic harshness generated by the FM modulation. They essentially lobotomized the high end of the sound.
Lobotomized the sound.
Wow. What you are left with is a terrifyingly clean, massive, foundational sub-bass frequency. It has the punch of a kick drum and the pure low-end weight of a synthesizer, perfectly quantized to the digital grid.
Okay, here is where I have to push back on the producers, and maybe you can explain their logic to me. Because they spent hours building this pristine, massive, mathematically perfect foundational bass line. It hits harder than any real bass ever could. It is flawless.
Right.
And then they essentially throw it into the background and force a human being to play over it. They bring out a live bass player to record over the perfect digital track. From a studio budget and time perspective, that sounds like absolute madness. Why not just use the perfect digital bass?
Because perfect music makes human beings deeply uncomfortable.
Really?
Yeah, we are pattern-seeking machines, yes. We like rhythm, but cognitive science has shown that when a musical pattern is flawlessly fluent, when every single note hits at the exact mathematical millisecond it is supposed to, with the exact same velocity, our brains register it as a threat. It triggers the musical equivalent of the uncanny valley.
The uncanny valley. Like when a CGI human face looks almost real, but the eyes are dead and it creeps you out.
Precisely. Flawless digital music likes the micro variations in timing and dynamics that signal human physical effort. When a real human plays a bass guitar, the fleshy part of their thumb might brush the string differently on the fourth beat.
Or they might just be tired.
Right, they might be a millisecond late on the downbeat because their wrist is tired. Those micro flaws communicate vulnerability and emotion. If you remove them entirely, the music feels sociopathic.
Sociopathic music, I love it.
Feels robotic and untrustworthy. By layering a live human bass over the pristine digital sub-bass, the producers are engineering what psychologists call the imperfection bias. We naturally prefer and trust things that display minor, authentic flaws.
You know, it goes back to the CGI versus practical effects debate in filmmaking.
Oh, exactly.
You can render a photorealistic monster entirely in a computer. It can look technically flawless. But the human eye almost always detects a slight lack of weight, a lack of gravity. The physics just feel a little floaty.
Because it's not actually displacing air in a real room.
Right. But when you build a physical animatronic puppet, or you blow up a real miniature building, it has flaws. The light reflects off the dust in the air. The mechanics might jerk slightly. Those physical imperfections give the image gravity and reality. In Flowers, that heavily filtered trillion synth bass is the CGI. It provides the massive, impossible scale. But the live human bass is the practical effect. It gives the track a tangible, physical texture that grounds the entire song.
That is exactly the dynamic at play. And the specific way the live bass was played is deeply rooted in the history of dance music. The bassists didn't use their fingers, they played with a heavy pick, and they constantly muted the strings with the palm of their fingers.
A palm-muted pick bass. It gives you that very distinct, aggressive thud.
Yes. The hard plastic of the pick provides a sharp initial transient, a massive click of attack. But the flesh of the palm immediately stops the string from ringing out. It kills the sustain.
So it's almost like a drum.
It turns a melodic instrument into a purely percussive one. This was the signature technique of legendary 1970s disco bassists like Bernard Edwards from Sheep. It allows the bass lines to become incredibly syncopated and rhythmic without muddying up the low end of the mix.
And the groove is so dynamic. When Miley hits the first word of the chorus, that bass is incredibly tight and authoritative. It hits exactly with the beat. But as the song progresses into the post-chorus, the bass line starts to stretch out.
It breathes.
It slides around the beat, becoming looser, creating a deeper, funkier pocket. But the way they captured that groove is the craziest part of the whole human element. They didn't just have the bassist jam out and keep the best take.
No, they did not.
The session notes reveal that the producer used a technique called tomping, which is short for compiling. And they forced the bassist to play the song 39 times.
39 distinct takes is an they absolutely refused to quantize the live bass. In fact, the producers went in manually and nudged specific notes slightly ahead of the digital grid and pulled other notes slightly behind the beat.
They manually programmed the flaws.
They intentionally programmed latency and rushing to maintain what they called a laid-back feeling. They spent hours upon hours using supercomputers to meticulously simulate the sound of a human being who is just slightly too relaxed to play perfectly in time.
They engineered the human anchor. They perfectly sculpted the flaws. And it's that human anchor, that deep, thuddy, perfectly flawed bass line that finally allows the song to unleash its most aggressive element.
The explicit beat layer.
Exactly. Because once the bass establishes the groove, the song finally activates Alan Moore's explicit beat layer. The drums arrive, and the architecture, the rhythm in this song completely dictates the emotional journey of the listener.
The drums in Flowers are a masterclass in the manipulation of acoustic space. Let's examine the first half of the chorus. The tension from the drumless void has peaked. She sings the iconic line, "I can buy myself flowers," and the beat finally drops. But it is not the massive, booming, stadium-shaking explosion you might expect. The drums are incredibly tight, sharp, and brutally constrained. They feel claustrophobic.
The technical term the engineers used in our documentation is that the drums were heavily gated, specifically using a sidechain compression technique. And I feel like gated drums is a term everyone associates with the 1980s, like that massive booming snare sound of Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight.
Sure, yeah.
But what is actually happening mechanically with the gated snare in the first half of Flowers? Because it sounds completely different than an 80s drum track.
The 80s gated reverb is about making a sound artificially massive and then suddenly cutting it off. What is happening in Flowers is almost the inverse. It's about absolute isolation and constraint.
How does that work?
To understand it, we need to understand how sidechain compression alters a routing matrix. Normally, a standard audio compressor is like an automatic volume knob. If a vocal track gets too loud, the compressor instantly turns it down, flattening the dynamic range.
Right, to keep the mix balanced.
Exactly. But with sidechain compression, you sever the internal trigger. You use the volume of track A to trigger the compressor on track B. It creates an interdependent acoustic ecosystem.
I see.
If we imagine a musical seesaw, when track A gets loud, the compressor physically forces track B to get quiet.
So how did they apply the seesaw to the drum kit in Flowers?
The producers set up a hidden trigger track. This track produces no audible sound in the final mix. It just generates a silent, rhythmic pulse on every quarter note.
A silent pulse.
Okay. They took the output of that silent pulse and fed it into the sidechain input of a noise gate on the entire drum bus. Now, a noise gate is a destructive tool. It completely mutes an audio signal if it drops below a certain volume threshold, preventing background hiss from bleeding into a recording.
Like keeping a mic quiet when someone isn't singing.
Right. But here, they inverted its function. They used the silent rhythmic pulse to force the gate open and close.
The documentation notes that this gate reduced the gain, the volume of the drums by a massive minus 14 decibels, and it utilized a long release time.
If I'm a listener, what does a 14 decibel drop actually feel like to my ear?
It feels like the air is being sucked out of the room. When the silent trigger pulses, the gate snaps open and you hear the full punchy impact of the snare drum. But the absolute millisecond the trigger stops, the gate violently slams shut.
It just cuts it off.
A 14 decibel drop essentially cuts the volume by more than half instantly. It aggressively chops off the natural decay of the snare shell vibrating. It truncates the physical reverberation of the room the drums were recorded in.
And what about the long release time you mentioned?
Because they used a long release time, meaning the gate fades shut smoothly rather than clicking. It leaves just the faintest ghostly whisper of the hi-hats lingering on the upbeats. The result is a drum groove that sounds like it's hyperventilating. It is so isolated. Smack, silence, smack, silence. There is absolutely zero bleed between the instruments.
It creates a sense of rigid, almost suffocating control. The rhythm is driving the song forward, but it feels heavily constrained. It feels like it is being held back by an invisible leash.
But then we hit the halfway point of the chorus. And I want to pause here and ask another structural question.
Sure.
Because from a purely commercial hit-making perspective, if you have established a killer groove in the first half of your chorus, the golden rule of pop music is to let it ride. You don't mess with the groove.
Generally, yeah.
You want people dancing in the club, you want them nodding their heads in the car. But halfway through the chorus of Flowers, the entire drum pattern completely shifts into what we call a 4 on the floor beat. Why intentionally disrupt the rhythmic foundation of your chorus right in the middle of it?
Because the rhythm section is not just there to make you dance, it is the physical manifestation of the lyric's psychological state.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The narrative arc of the chorus is a journey from internal realization to external declaration. In the first half, she sings, "I can buy myself flowers, write my name in the sand, talk to myself for hours." That is an internal monologue.
It's very isolated.
It is the sound of someone quietly, desperately trying to convince themselves that they're going to survive the heartbreak. The tight, claustrophobic, gated drums perfectly reflect that internal constraint. The music feels like someone holding their breath.
Wow. The sidechain gate is literally acting out her psychological repression.
Precisely. But look at the lyrics in the second half of the chorus. "I can take myself dancing and I can hold my own hand. Yeah, I can love me better than you can."
The tone totally shifts.
The realization has solidified. It shifts from quiet survival to pure, unadulterated self-empowerment. It is an external celebration, and the music has to physically release the tension it has been holding since the drumless void of the first verse.
And the mechanism for that release is the four on the floor kick.
Yes. The four on the floor pattern is the bedrock of 1970s disco and 1980s house music. The kick drum stops playing a complex syncopated pattern and just starts hitting relentlessly on every single beat. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So the energy just surges.
It lands right on top of the snare drum. The invisible leash of the noise gate is released. The room sound opens up. The physical weight of the kick drum on every downbeat provides a massive, cathartic, physical release for the listener. It is an emotional gear shift engineered entirely through drum programming.
It is brilliant. And speaking of brilliant drum programming, there is one detail in the explicit beat layer that we really have to discuss, and it ties right back into our discussion about the cognitive science of human flaws.
The claps.
It's the claps. Throughout the song, layered underneath the snare drum, you hear these massive hand claps. But they didn't just drag and drop a single clap sample onto the grid. They utilized a technique that engineers call flaming.
Flaming is one of those subtle tricks that separates a sterile demo from a Grammy-winning mix.
How does it work?
Well, when you hear a group of people clapping in a room, it never sounds like a single, sharp crack. Sound travels at roughly 343 meters per second. The person standing 10 feet away from the microphone is going to have their clap captured slightly later than the person standing 1 foot away.
Plus, nobody has perfect timing.
Exactly. Human reaction times vary. Someone will clap slightly early, someone will clap late.
Right, human clapping is chaotic.
It is entirely chaotic phase cancellation. To recreate this organic chaos digitally, the producers didn't just layer 3 different clap sounds on top of each other. They took those individual clap samples and manually pulled them off the digital grid.
Just like they did with the bass.
Yep. They placed one clap sample 10 milliseconds ahead of the snare drum. They placed another clap 15 milliseconds behind the snare drum.
They created a temporal smear.
Exactly. Instead of a single digital transient hitting at once, the sound spreads out, it ripples, it flames. And going back to the imperfection bias, this microscopic manipulation of milliseconds profoundly changes how your brain processes the song.
Because it sounds real.
Right, if a machine triggers a perfect clap exactly on the snare hit 100 times in a row, you feel isolated. But by flaming the claps, the producers subconsciously signal to your brain that you are in a large physical space surrounded by a slightly uncoordinated community of human beings. It creates an auditory illusion of fellowship and warmth.
Which provides the absolute perfect segue into our next phase of analysis. Because if the bass and the drums are the foundation and the framing of our 3D printed cabin, the producers still had to put the paint and the wallpaper on. They had to dress the track.
Right, the aesthetic layer.
And they draped this entire song in a very specific, meticulously crafted sonic aesthetic that acts as Moore's novelty and harmonic filler layers. Or look closely at this 70s Polish.
It really is a fascinating juxtaposition. You have this hyper-modern, intensely calculated drum programming with sidechain routing, but the actual instrumentation surrounding it sounds like it was lifted directly from a 1976 Studio 54 vinyl record.
Let's talk specifically about the string orchestration, because when those sweeping disco strings arrive in the post-chorus, it is pure magic. It sounds like a 40-piece orchestra sweeping through a massive analog console.
It sounds huge.
But they didn't hire a massive orchestra. The documentation reveals they relied heavily on a software instrument called Contact Session Strings Pro, which they then painstakingly layered with individual close-mic'd violins and cellos. But out of the box, a digital string library sounds incredibly sterile. It sounds like a plastic. How did they digitally engineer a software plugin to sound like an authentic, vintage reading strings?
The signal chain they use to age those digital strings is a masterclass in modern mixing. It involves 3 highly destructive steps. First, they applied a plugin simply known as OTT.
Over-the-top compression?
Over the top is an understatement. OTT is an extremely aggressive multi-band compressor. Standard downward compression, like we discussed earlier with the drum, just takes the loudest peaks of a sound and squashes them down. But OTT applies both downward and upward compression simultaneously. It violently squashes the loudest sounds down, but it also takes the absolute quietest, microscopic background noises and violently pulls them up in volume.
It completely flattens the dynamic range to a solid brick of sound.
It does, and what that accomplishes in the context of string samples is phenomenal. The producer specifically noted that the OTT compression allows the listener to literally hear the hair moving on the strings.
Yeah.
By pulling the quietest frequencies up, it highlights them they are. The heavy iron transformers inside those Neve consoles didn't just pass electricity through, they physically altered the signal, imparting complex second and third order harmonic distortion to the audio. Our brains interpret this specific distortion as warmth and thickness.
So to recreate that, the producers ran the heavily compressed digital strings through a software emulator of a classic Neve preamp.
But they didn't just run it through cleanly. The producer used a very specific, aggressive technique. They ran the Neve emulator in mic mode, which is designed for low-level microphone signals.
Okay, what did that do?
They cranked the virtual input gain incredibly high, purposefully overloading the digital algorithm to force it to generate massive amounts of harmonic saturation and grit. It's like revving a car engine into the red line.
But wouldn't that just blow out the speakers?
It would, but to prevent the actual volume from clipping and destroying the entire mix, they simultaneously engaged a virtual minus 20 decibel pad on the output.
So they're driving the virtual transformer as hard as computationally possible to generate the smoke and grit of a 1970s recording studio, but strictly containing the actual volume so it sits politely in the mix. It is controlled acoustic violence.
That's a great way to put it. And the final step in the string chain is spatial. They needed to put these gritty strings into a physical room.
Right.
In the 1970s, they didn't have digital reverb algorithms. If you wanted an echo, you had to use physics. So the producers utilized an emulator of an EMT 140 plate reverb.
And a physical plate reverb is wild. It was literally a massive 600-pound sheet of cold rolled steel suspended by springs inside a wooden box.
Yeah.
They would fire sound into the metal sheet, let it vibrate, and record the metallic vibration.
Exactly. And because sound travels through steel much faster and differently than it travels through air, a plate reverb produces a very dense, shimmering, almost metallic echo tail that lacks the early reflections of a real room.
So it's very distinct.
It is the defining spatial characteristic of classic disco. By applying the algorithmic math of a vibrating 600-pound sheet of metal to the overcompressed, Neve-saturated digital strings, they successfully synthesized a ghost. They conjured the exact sonic illusion of 1976.
It is audio time travel. But the strings are just the grandest, most obvious part of the illusion. Throughout the entire runtime of the song, the producers have buried dozens of microscopic, almost subliminal sounds that audio engineers refer to as ear candy.
Ear candy resides almost exclusively in the novelty layer. These are the fleeting, often unidentifiable production flourishes that serve no fundamental harmonic or rhythmic purpose, but are absolutely essential to keeping the listener's brain engaged for 3 minutes.
I always think of ear candy like a really complex culinary recipe. Say you are eating an incredible slow-simmered curry. You can identify the major components. You taste the chicken, you taste the coconut milk, you taste the major spices like turmeric and cumin. But hidden deep within the sauce, the chef added a single tiny pinch of star anise, or 1 drop of tamarind paste. You might not explicitly register the tamarind on your palate. You probably couldn't name it if someone asked. But if the chef forgot to add it, the entire dish would taste inexplicably flat and two-dimensional. That is what ear candy does to a pop mix.
A fantastic analogy. So what specific spices did they hide in the mix of flowers?
The breakdown highlights some incredibly subtle choices. First, throughout the beat, they layered glass percussion sounds and shakers directly over the kick and snare drums. But they mixed them incredibly quietly tucked away at around minus 24 decibels.
At minus 24 decibels, those shakers are practically invisible to the conscious mind.
Exactly. You cannot cannot hear them as individual instruments unless you isolate the track, but what they do is add a continuous high-frequency rustling texture that glues the sharp transients of the drums together.
Like a sheen.
Right. They act as an acoustic halo around the rhythm section, giving it a relentless forward momentum. Then there's the reverse string effect in the verse. And this isn't just taking an audio file and playing it backwards.
No, the logs show they created the reverse effect dynamically using filter automation.
Right. They automated the input gain on a high-pass filter, forcing the volume to suck aggressively upward right before Miley delivers a new vocal line. It creates a literal acoustic vacuum that physically pulls the listener's ear into the lyric.
It builds subconscious anticipation.
And then, during the massive chorus drop, there is an organ supporting for vocal melody, but they didn't want it to sound like a church. So they ran the organ through a distortion plugin called Decapitator.
The Sound Toys Decapitator. As the name heavily implies, it is designed to completely destroy an audio signal using analog saturation modeling.
They drove it so hard that it ceases to be an organ. It just becomes this growling, aggressive harmonic thickness sitting right beneath her vocal cords, adding weight to her empowerment.
It gives it that grit.
But my absolute favorite piece of hidden ear candy happens precisely one beat before the post-chorus drops. There's a sudden, extreme glitch on a distorted synthesizer patch.
You're talking about the Camel Crusher vibrato, correct?
Yes. Camel Crusher is a very famous freeware plugin known for its aggressive distortion and compression. But right before the drop, the producers fully cranked the depth on the tremolo setting to 100%, just a fraction of a second.
Oh, that's such a cool trick.
It sounds like a piece of vintage analog machinery suddenly short-circuiting and violently vibrating out of control right before the smooth, lush 70s disco strings arrive. It is a brilliant collision of chaotic digital texture and smooth vintage instrumentation.
It is entirely meticulous. Every single shaker hit, every filter sweep, every gated snare has been ruthlessly calculated. None of it is arbitrary.
Nope.
But what is truly fascinating is that all of the 70s nostalgia, all of this analog emulation, is entirely in service of a much larger, overarching thematic conversation. The 1970s aesthetic isn't the only way Flowers looks backward.
Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most controversial segment of our deep dive. Because the song is fundamentally constructed as a lyrical, thematic, and musical conversation with a very specific, massive hit from a decade prior. We have to talk about Bruno Mars's 2012 absolute smash hit, That Was Your Man.
The internet recognized this connection almost the very day Flowers was released. It operates as a direct, almost surgical lyrical inversion.
Let's break down the exact lines, because it is undeniable. In Bruno Mars's song, he is entirely inhabiting the role of the regretful mourning ex-partner.
Right.
He sings, "I should have bought you flowers and held your hand, should give you all my hours when I had the chance." It is a passive lament about things left undone.
And Miley Cyrus takes those exact lyrical motifs, those exact thematic building blocks, and structurally flips them into an active declaration of independence.
She systematically answers his regrets with her own self-sufficiency. She responds, "I can buy myself flowers, write my name in the sand, talk to myself for hours, say things you don't understand. I can take myself dancing and I can hold my own hand." It is brilliant meta-songwriting.
Lyrically, it absolutely functions as a response song, but the similarities don't end at the thematic lyrics. And this is where we have to delve into the underlying music theory, because this is what ultimately triggered one of the most fascinating lawsuits in modern pop music.
Let's lay out the objective music theory facts, comparing the two songs side by side. Viscerally, they feel entirely unrelated. Bruno Mars's track is a slow, mournful, 73 beat per minute piano ballad.
Very slow.
And Miley Cyrus's track is a driving 118 beat per minute disco pop dance anthem.
They occupy entirely different sonic universes, but underneath the hood, the scaffolding shares undeniable similarities. Both songs are written in the exact same key, C major, and more importantly, both songs start their primary verse progressions on an A minor chord.
Let's look at the chords. Bruno's verse progression is A minor to C major to D minor to G major to a G7, and finally resolving on C major.
Okay.
Miley's verse progression, the one played on that synthesized wordlets we talked about, is A minor 7 to C major to G major to C major 7.
Now, to a layman reading a blog post, hearing that they share the exact same key and start on the exact same minor chord sounds like a smoking gun for plagiarism. But from a musicological perspective, we have to provide context.
Right, it's not that simple.
In Western popular music, starting a sad, reflective, or melancholic song in the key of C major on an A minor chord is one of the most thoroughly exhausted tropes in existence.
Why is that specific move so common?
Because A minor is the relative minor of C major. They share the exact same key signature, no sharps or flats. By starting a major key song on the relative minor chord, you immediately inject a sense of emotional ambiguity and tension. It feels unresolved.
Because you aren't starting on the root.
Exactly. There are literally tens of thousands of blues, jazz, and pop standards that utilize this exact harmonic pathway. It is a fundamental building block of emotional storytelling in music.
And the melodies layered over those chords are distinctly different. Miley's melody in the verse is incredibly rhythmic and constrained, riding on steady, repetitive quarter notes. Bruno's melody is highly syncopated, fluid, and utilizes a massive, sweeping vocal range.
However, the combination of the direct lyrical inversion combined with the shared harmonic neighborhood and the similar emotional cadence of the chorus was enough to trigger massive legal action.
And we really need to explain the mechanics of this lawsuit because it is a mind-bending look at how the modern music industry operates on a corporate level. In September 2024, a massive copyright infringement lawsuit was officially filed against Miley Cyrus, her co-writers Gregory Hine and Michael Pollack, and massive distributors including Sony Music and Apple.
But here's the absolute most critical, astonishing detail of this entire legal drama. Bruno Mars himself did not sue Miley Cyrus.
Bruno Mars not.
That is a vital distinction that often gets lost in categories. So if the original artist isn't suing, who is driving the litigation?
A corporate entity called Tempo Music Investments.
And this is where we have to explain the financialization of modern music publishing. How did an investment firm get the right to sue over a pop song?
Over the last decade, Wall Street has aggressively entered the music industry. Massive investment firms and private equity groups began treating music copyrights as an alternative asset class, completely divorced from the art itself.
Just like buying stocks.
They view a hit song's royalty stream exactly the same way they view a stock dividend or a real estate portfolio. So, around 2020, Tempo Music Investments purchased a portion of the copyright catalog belonging to a man named Philip Lawrence.
And Philip Lawrence is one of the 4 original co-writers of When I Was Your Man, alongside Bruno Mars, Ari Levine, and Andrew Wyatt.
Exactly. So an investment firm, which only owns a fractional, partial share of the underlying composition purchased from one single co-writer, is taking it upon themselves to claim that Flowers is an unauthorized derivative work.
It's wild.
In their legal filings, they allege that Flowers duplicates numerous melodic, harmonic, and lyrical elements, including specific chord progressions and the connecting bass line movements.
And their goal is to extract financial compensation based on their fractional ownership.
They are seeking unspecified financial damages, and they ask the court to fundamentally stop the reproduction and distribution of Flowers. They want to shut the song down.
Which is a huge demand.
Now, on the other side of the courtroom, Miley Cyrus's legal team fired back. They filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit entirely in November of 2024. And their defense is a fascinating two-pronged attack on modern copyright law.
Let's break down their arguments. What is their primary procedural defense?
The first argument attacks the very nature of fractional ownership. Cyrus's lawyers argue that Tempo Music Investments possesses a fatal flaw in their lawsuit. They lack legal standing.
Okay, meaning what?
The argument is essentially this. Because Tempo only acquired rights from one of the 4 co-authors, they are merely a minority shareholder in the song. Therefore, they do not possess the unambiguous legal authority to unilaterally sue for infringement without the active participation and agreement of the other original writers.
Including Bruno Mars, who has remained entirely silent.
Exactly. It is a brilliant legal maneuver that tests the mechanical limits of Wall Street's involvement in music. Can a corporate entity that bought a 25% slice of a song weaponize it in court without the artist's permission?
It could set a massive precedent, but their second argument attacks the musical claims directly, right?
Yes, they categorically deny copying the composition. In their motion, they state that the allegedly copied elements are, and I quote, random, scattered, unprotected ideas and musical building blocks.
The building blocks defense is the bedrock of musicological legal theory.
They're basically looking at the judge and saying, you cannot copyright the idea of singing about buying flowers. You cannot copyright an independent woman holding her own hand. And you certainly cannot copyright the physical concept of moving from an A minor chord to a C major chord. These are fundamental frequencies of sound available to everyone.
And this lawsuit touches on a profound, ongoing philosophical debate in the culture at large. It forces us to contextualize Flowers not just as a pop song, but within the long, rich historical tradition of the response song.
Right.
Throughout the history of folk, blues, and early R&B, musicians constantly, openly borrowed melodies, lyrical tropes, and chord structures from one another to create meta-dialogues.
It's the foundation of American music. I mean, Woody Guthrie literally wrote "This Land Is Your Land" as a direct, agitated lyrical response to the melody and theme of God Bless America.
Great example.
Nicki Minaj's Anaconda is a direct, empowering response to the male gaze of Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back. Hip-hop was built entirely on the concept of sampling and recontextualizing the past to build the future.
So the question that the courts, the musicologists, and the culture at large have to untangle is this. At what exact point does responding to a song lyrically and utilizing similar thematic chord tropes to purposely invoke a specific feeling or memory in the listener cross the invisible line from brilliant, culturally resonant meta-songwriting into actionable, illegal copyright infringement?
It's so tricky.
Where is the mathematical line between artistic homage and financial theft?
It is the ultimate gray area. It's a landscape with no clear X-ray. And while the corporate lawyers and the investment firms battle in federal court over fractions of copyrights and the legal definition of an A minor chord, the song itself remains entirely unfazed.
It just keeps streaming.
It continues to just exist, floating in the atmosphere as a towering monument of modern pop culture.
It truly is a monument to modern engineering and human psychology.
So as we wrap up this incredibly deep dive, let's step back and look at the totality of what we have unpacked over the last hour. Flowers did not achieve its historic, record-shattering dominance merely because of celebrity gossip.
Definitely not.
It didn't sit on the charts for over 2 years just because it had a clever lyrical nod to an older Bruno Mars hit. It achieved its dominance through a masterful, microscopic, psychological manipulation of pop music texture.
We trace that manipulation literally from the very first second of the waveform. The producers created a terrifying, deliberate oral void, withholding the explicit beat layer to build an unbearable neurological tension.
Just brilliant.
They forced the listener to focus entirely on the vulnerability of the vocal narrative, supporting it with nothing but the gritty, mathematically calculated LFO modulation of a digitally synthesized Wurlitzer, specifically targeting the 4 kHz frequency band to hack our evolutionary attention span.
Then they established gravity. But they didn't ground the track with a flawless, intimidating computer algorithm. They replaced perfection with the human anchor.
The bass line.
They forced a human being to play a palm-muted pick bass 39 separate times, chopping the takes together, but intentionally refusing to quantize them, leaving the notes lazily dragging behind the beat to satisfy our cognitive craving for imperfection.
They transitioned seamlessly from the tight, claustrophobic, sidechain-gated snare drum, a physical manifestation of internal psychological constraint, into the explosive, cathartic, 4-on-the-floor kick drum of external empowerment. They smeared the timing of the claps to create the auditory illusion of a physical community.
And finally, they dressed that entire architectural structure in lush, meticulously faked 1970s nostalgia. They drove digital string samples through screaming virtual Neve transformers, utilizing over-the-top compression to make the physical friction of the bow hair audible, bouncing the signal off the simulated physics of a 600-pound steel plate, and burying subtle culinary spices like reverse filters and minus 24 decibel shakers deep within the mix to keep the subconscious mind perpetually engaged.
It is an extraordinary, exhausting feat of human engineering.
It is the 3D printed cabin executed flawlessly.
It really is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought to ponder as you take your headphones off and go about your day.
Lay it on us.
We are currently living in an era defined by rapid technological advancement. Artificial intelligence and digital perfection are easier to achieve right now than at any other point in human history.
No, let it doubt.
You can open a laptop, push a single button, and a generative algorithm will instantly output a mathematically flawless, perfectly tuned, perfectly quantized piece of audio. The tools for absolute, sterile, terrifying perfection are now universally available to anyone with a Wi-Fi connection.
Kind of scary when you think about it.
It is, yet in this exact era of impending algorithmic perfection, Flowers became the biggest, most dominant song in the world. And it did so by meticulously, painstakingly utilizing all of that advanced digital technology, not to achieve perfection, but to engineer human imperfection.
They use computers to be human.
Exactly. They used the most advanced software on Earth, running on massive supercomputers to make sure the hand claps were slightly chaotic, to make sure the bass line slid lazily and incorrectly behind the beat, and to simulate the gritty, broken distortion of an outdated 1970s analog console.
That's such a beautiful contradiction.
It forces us to ask a fundamental question about the future of art. Does the success of this track prove that no matter how advanced music technology gets, no matter how flawless our generative AI models become, the human brain will always subconsciously distrust absolute perfection?
Will we always crave the flaws?
Will we always ultimately biologically crave the sound of human vulnerability? Will we always need to hear the slight, tired drag of a finger on a bass string, the chaotic, rippling flame of a crowd clapping slightly out of time, and the grit of failing machinery to actually feel something?
I think it absolutely does. The blueprint of a perfect pop song isn't a clean, straight mathematical line. It's jagged, it's messy, it's full of ghosts, and it is deeply, beautifully human.
Well said.
The next time you hear flowers playing ambiently in the grocery store or coming through your car radio, I invite you to ignore the celebrity drama. Listen past the catchy melody. Focus solely on that invisible shaker loop hiding in the background. Listen for the violently chopped acoustic tail of that gated snare drum. And feel the slightly imperfect, lazy, heavy groove of that live bass line pulling against the digital grid. You might just hear the biggest song in the world for the very first time.